It was a typical Sunday afternoon in Salford, and the Brass Handles pub was packed with regulars enjoying the football. Manchester United were comfortably ahead of Newcastle. The atmosphere was lively, and nobody inside suspected that a gangland execution was moments away from unfolding. Two young men entered the pub carrying loaded handguns, sent there with one purpose: to kill a known local enforcer, David Totten. But within minutes the plan unraveled. Instead of making their escape, the gunmen were overpowered, disarmed, and shot with their own weapons. They staggered outside and collapsed on the grass, fatally wounded. Remarkably, Totten survived. The attackers didn't. And in true Salford fashion, nobody inside that pub said a single word to the police, not then, and not in the years since. What was meant to be a clean, calculated hit turned into one of Greater Manchester's most shocking underworld moments. A failed assassination that exposed hidden feuds, deadly loyalties, and a criminal network willing to sacrifice its own. This is the story of the Brass Handles double murder. An ambush that went so wrong, it left the streets of Salford talking in hushed tones for years to come. In the world of gangland Britain, the faces on the front line are often the youngest and the most disposable. Richard Austin was just 19 years old and Carlton Alvarenga only 20. Both were from Moss Side in Manchester, an area that's seen its fair share of crime, poverty, and postcode wars. By all accounts, neither was a seasoned hitman. They weren't professionals, they were pawns. Young men with past convictions, old debts, and few options. Police later believed they were pushed into the job, not for profit, but to wipe their slate clean with the wrong people. Their target, David Totten, was no small-time name in Salford. He was known for being volatile, violent, and well-connected. His reputation had been growing rapidly, too rapidly for some. He wasn't part of any single gang, but he was feared and unpredictable, and that alone made him a problem. Wherever Totten went, tension followed. The man who allegedly ordered his killing was Bobby Spears, a Salford gangster with deep ties to the criminal underworld. Spears wasn't a street enforcer. He was a boss, operating from a distance. Wealthy, well-dressed, and calculating. On the day of the shooting, he had placed himself in the VIP box at Old Trafford, watching Manchester United, pint in hand, with what he must have thought was the perfect alibi. But Spears didn't act alone. He brought in Ian MacLeod, a veteran of South Manchester's Doddington gang. Though supposedly retired from serious crime, MacLeod still had influence and reach. He was tasked with arranging the logistics, getting the guns, finding the manpower, and directing the hit. That manpower turned out to be Austin and Alvarenga. To complete the setup, Constance Howarth was placed inside the pub. A convicted arms trafficker, she watched the target from across the bar and sent quiet, deliberate messages to MacLeod. Her role was to guide the killers in and out without fuss. It was, on paper, a complete operation. Experienced players, a well-planned alibi, and two young men ready to do the dirty work. But plans don't always play out the way they're drawn up. And once the doors to that pub opened, everything changed in seconds. The roots of this failed hit stretch back to what seems, on the surface, like a petty nightclub spat. A night in Manchester, sometime before the shooting, saw David Totten refused entry to a club. He claimed to be a friend of Bobby Spears, who was already inside. The doorman brought Spears to the door, expecting him to vouch for Totten. But instead, Spears acted like he didn't even know him. It was a public humiliation, and Totten didn't take it lightly. In the weeks that followed, Totten began drinking in the Brass Handles, a pub known to be Spears' local haunt. If it was meant to intimidate Spears, it worked. Totten wasn't just showing his face, he was making a statement. He wasn't backing down, and that deeply unsettled Spears. He saw it as disrespect, dangerous in his world where image is everything. And in gangland circles, once you've lost face, you've lost control. Spears quietly began to orchestrate a plan to eliminate Totten. He turned to Ian MacLeod, trusted, experienced, and still feared. McLeod's job was to handle the operation discreetly. But instead of hardened professionals, the ones chosen to carry out the shooting were two young lads already weighed down with debt. Carlton Alvarenga and Richard Austin weren't given a choice. They were nudged, if not outright forced, into the job. Constance Howarth sat casually at the bar with a clear view of the snooker room, played her part without hesitation. She guided the shooters over the phone, feeding updates to McLeod. Totten was sitting with mates, having a drink, unaware that a team was closing in. It was supposed to be quick. In and out. Leave no trace. The shooters were even told they'd be able to blend in and escape in the commotion. But this wasn't just any pub, and Totten wasn't just any target. The moment they walked through those doors, the plan began to fall apart. It was just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, the 12th of March, 2006. The Brass Handles pub, tucked away in Edge Hill Close, Pendleton, Salford, was heaving. Manchester United were 2-0 up against Newcastle. The atmosphere was loud, relaxed, and typically boisterous for a weekend match day. Families, locals, and regulars were enjoying the game. Among them, sat at a table near the snooker room, was David Totten, alongside his close associate Aaron Travers and a group of mates. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. Outside, a Ford Mondeo was parked nearby. Inside the car were Richard Austin and Carlton Alvarenga, masked, armed, and under pressure. Ian McLeod, who had driven them there, was still in the area. Police believed McLeod had to force them out of the car, either by pressuring them or even physically pushing them to make them go through with it. These weren't hitmen walking in with confidence. They were young, hesitant, and knew they were walking into dangerous territory. Inside the pub, sat at the bar, was Constance Howarth. From her seat she had a clear view of the snooker room. She sent updates to McLeod via mobile phone, quietly confirming Totten's exact location. At around 2:15 p.m., the two young men entered the pub. At least one of the weapons was confirmed in court to be a 9mm, the type commonly used in gang-related shootings. Witnesses later described it as a surreal shift. The room turned from cheers to chaos in seconds. Without saying a word, Richard Austin raised his handgun and opened fire, striking David Totten 6 times in the face and chest. The impact should have been fatal, but somehow, Totten survived. Aaron Travers, one of Totten's close mates, was also hit during the chaos. He had jumped up during the gunfire, possibly trying to protect his friend. Both men were seriously wounded, but alive. For a few moments, it seemed as if the hit had gone to plan. The shooters had located their targets, opened fire, and caused devastation. But just as quickly as it had started, the entire operation began to unravel. Carlton Alvarenga's weapon jammed. Whether it was due to a fault with the gun or the sheer panic of the moment remains unclear. But then, everything fell apart. The atmosphere inside the pub shifted instantly. The drinkers didn't run, they fought back. One of the tables was overturned and used as a makeshift shield. In a burst of instinctive action, a group of drinkers charged the two gunmen. The two young gunmen were overpowered and disarmed. These weren't hired killers facing an easy escape. They were two young lads who were now outnumbered, outgunned, and in serious trouble. What was meant to be a swift and silent execution had become a violent free-for-all. Austin and Alvarenga stumbled out of the pub, bleeding and desperate. They crossed the road and collapsed on the grass beside Fitzwarren Street. There they died from their injuries, surrounded by a growing crowd of onlookers. By the time emergency services arrived, both were beyond help. Back inside the pub, the scene was being swiftly tidied. In classic Salford style, someone ripped the CCTV system from the wall. Phones disappeared. Witnesses melted away into silence. What was supposed to be a clean hit in broad daylight ended with two young men dead in the street and a trail of silence left behind. But the story wasn't over. Because while no one inside the pub was talking, their phones had plenty to say. When police arrived at the Brass Handles pub, they were met with absolute carnage. Two young men, Richard Austin and Carlton Alvarenga, lay dead just outside on the grass verge. Inside, glass was shattered, tables overturned, and panic still hung in the air. But despite the dozens of people present, officers quickly realized they were facing one of the hardest tasks in gangland policing. Silence. No one claimed to have seen a thing. No one could identify the shooters. The CCTV system had already been ripped out, and the message was clear. This is Salford. You don't talk to the law. Totten and Travers, now recovering from gunshot wounds in hospital, offered no help either. Neither gave a statement, and neither identified who returned fire on the gunman. With no eyewitnesses, no weapons recovered, and no CCTV, detectives were left with little more than two bodies, and a pair of discarded mobile phones found beside them. That detail, however, would prove critical. One of the phones, a pay-as-you-go handset, had been topped up recently. Officers traced the top-up to a supermarket, where it had been paid for using a loyalty card registered to Ian McLeod. From that small link, police began to unravel a wider chain of communications. Cross-referencing call data, they discovered regular contact between McLeod, Constance Howarth, and a third man, Bobby Spears, who had fled to Spain within days of the shooting. The timing of the calls aligned perfectly with the planning and execution of the hit. Police found that Howarth had sent messages from inside the pub, guiding the gunmen to their targets. McLeod remained close by in his Ford Mondeo, keeping watch. He was calling from the comfort of an executive box at Old Trafford, where he was watching the Manchester United match, the same game being shown in the pub. This web of phone activity gave investigators the breakthrough they needed. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapons, and no forensics that could prove who fired the fatal shots. But what they had was coordination, calls, texts, and movement patterns that clearly outlined a conspiracy. In 2007, both McLeod and Howarth were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Though no one was ever charged with the actual killing of Austin and Alvarenga, the Crown built its case around the planning of the hit itself. Police made it clear. These two young men were sent into the Brass Handles by a group who knew the risks and saw them as expendable. As for Spears, he remained abroad until 2008, when he was located in Benidorm and extradited back to the UK under a European arrest warrant. He was finally charged and put on trial in 2009. All three were eventually convicted, not because anyone talked, but because the evidence was buried in their own digital footprints. By the time the case reached court, Greater Manchester Police knew they wouldn't be getting any help from witnesses. The wall of silence surrounding the Brass Handles pub remained firmly intact. No one inside had broken rank. Totten and Travers refused to speak. There were no forensics, no murder weapon, and no one charged with pulling the trigger. But what the Crown had was something else. Cold, traceable digital evidence. And it was enough. In March 2007, Ian McLeod and Constance Howarth stood trial at Preston Crown Court, both charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecution laid out a clear timeline. McLeod had coordinated the shooters, driving them to the scene, while Howarth acted as a spotter from inside the pub. She had directed the pair to their targets, using text messages sent just moments before the attack. The case didn't rely on any direct witness statements. It was built almost entirely on mobile phone data. Records showed a pattern of communication between Howarth, McLeod, and Bobby Spears in the hours leading up to the shooting. It also showed Spears making calls from his seat at Old Trafford during the match, aligning perfectly with the attack timeline. Both McLeod and Howarth were found guilty. McLeod, once a feared name in the Doddington crew, was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 21 years. Howarth, dubbed by locals as the Black Widow due to her criminal past, was also handed a life sentence, with a minimum of 20 years. During the trial, she insisted she was innocent, telling police, "I'm just a girl. I don't know anything about guns." The jury didn't believe a word of it. Years later, she launched a legal bid to overturn her conviction, but the Court of Appeal dismissed it. Lady Justice Carr described her claims as highly speculative, noting that the alternative suspect she named bore no resemblance to either Totten or Travers, but the mastermind of the plot, Bobby Spears, was still living freely in Spain, hiding among British expats in Benidorm. It wasn't until August 2008, more than 2 years after the shooting, that he was arrested and extradited back to the UK under a European arrest warrant. He went on trial in 2009. The evidence presented was damning. The phone records, the coordination with MacLeod and Howarth, and the carefully timed alibi at Old Trafford. All of it pointed to his central role in orchestrating the assassination attempt. During sentencing, Mr. Justice Griffith Williams described the case as a calculated and ruthless gangland execution attempt, adding that Spears had shown no concern for public safety by planning a hit inside a packed public house. Though no one has ever been charged with the actual killings of Richard Austin and Carlton Alvarenga, those who sent them in have faced justice. In May 2009, Spears was found guilty of conspiracy to murder and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 23 years. But for the families of the 2 young men, it was a bittersweet outcome. They were labeled expendable and died carrying out a plan that went disastrously wrong. If you found this case as fascinating as we did, hit the like button, subscribe, and make sure you've got notifications turned on. We've got more real British crime stories coming your way. No fluff, no fiction, just facts. Until next time, take care.